hate to say that, well, you can't use my as reach.
That is the voice of Duane Davis, better known as Keefe D, on a leaked Keefe D prison call recorded inside a Nevada detention center. He is the only man ever charged in the Tupac Shakur murder trial 2026, and he is actively trying to dismantle his own Duane Davis confession. For 5 years, Keefe D told the world he was there. He wrote a memoir called Compton Street Legend. He sat down for podcasts that generated millions of downloads. He gave television interviews that aired across the globe. In all of them, he proudly claimed he was sitting in the white Cadillac on Las Vegas Boulevard on September 7, 1996. He claimed he orchestrated the events that led to the shooting of the most famous rapper in history. He sold the story. He profited from the story. He built the final, lucrative chapter of his life on the foundation of that story. And now, facing the very real possibility of spending the rest of his natural life behind bars, he has a completely new story. He says the first one was a lie. He says he was hiding under a rock for 6 years. He got tired of being broke, and he made it all up for a paycheck. He claims the publishers twisted his words, the media exaggerated his role, and the public swallowed a fabricated tale because they were desperate for a villain in an unsolved tragedy. But in this leaked call, he doesn't just retract his confession. He drops a bombshell that changes the entire landscape of the trial. He implies that the people who are trying to put him in prison aren't the only ones who should be worried. He implies that there are other names, other people. People walking free, living down the street from the very person he is talking to on the other end of the line. You're watching the Black Docket. We track active cases. We follow the evidence. And we do not look away when the suspect speaks for himself. In today's documentary, the leaked prison call, the retraction of the confession, the psychological breakdown of a man caught in his own web, and the deadly game of leverage being played in a Las Vegas courtroom. If you're new here, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. To understand the immense weight of this phone call, we first have to understand the trap Keefe D built for himself, long before the handcuffs were ever placed on his wrists. Before we listen to the man in the prison cell, we have to look at the man in the recording studio. Between 2019 and 2023, Duane Davis was not hiding from his past. He was touring it. Following decades of absolute silence after the 1996 shooting, Keefe D realized that the cultural obsession with Tupac's death was a commodity. It was an endless well of curiosity, conspiracy, and cash, and he was the only person left alive who could sell it. He published his memoir, Compton Street Legend. In it, he didn't just hint at his involvement. He detailed it with the precision of a historian. He described the meeting in the park in Compton, where the plan was allegedly hatched. He described riding in the white Cadillac alongside his nephew, Orlando Anderson. He admitted he was the shot caller on the street level, the man who facilitated the retaliation for the brutal beating of his nephew at the MGM Grand earlier that day. He repeated these claims on the Art of War podcast. He sat down for BET interviews. He spoke with the swagger of a retired general, recounting a war he had survived. He was careful, legally speaking. He often framed his admissions as being an observer, a facilitator, or a co-conspirator, rather than the triggerman himself. He knew the boundaries of the law, but the narrative he painted for the public was crystal clear. Keefe D was in the car, and he helped make the murder happen. Why did he do it? Why admit to a capital crime on national television, broadcast to millions of people, including the very detectives who had been trying to nail him for 20 years? Because it paid. It secured lucrative book deals. It generated high-paying podcast fees. It kept his name relevant in an industry that had long since moved on to new tragedies and new icons. For years, he operated under the comfortable assumption that the statute of limitations had expired, or that the grave had sealed the secrets forever. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the passage of time was a shield that no prosecutor could pierce. Then, in September 2023, the police knocked on his door in Henderson, Nevada. They didn't want an interview. They didn't want a podcast episode. They wanted him in handcuffs. They took his profitable confession, handed it directly to the district attorney, and charged him with open murder with the use of a deadly weapon. Which brings us to the phone call. Because once Keefe D realized his book royalties were turning into a life sentence, the narrative changed overnight. The confident author vanished, and the cornered defendant emerged. Prison telephones are not private. This is not a secret. Every single inmate who picks up that receiver knows this. There is an automated voice that plays at the start of the call, explicitly warning that the conversation is being monitored and recorded by the authorities. The federal government and state prosecutors use these recordings to build cases, to track contraband, to monitor witness tampering, and to catch defendants slipping up. Keefe D knows he is being recorded. He has been in and out of the justice system his entire adult life, which makes what he says next either incredibly bold or incredibly reckless.
And then what's this book they say you wrote?
Yeah, I did. After that dude did that, I didn't breach that contract. He did.
Okay.
He off carry top. You know what I mean? Oh, bitch. He had my life. I clawed up under a rock for 6 years. And I just got tired of it. You know what I'm saying? Let them know the motherfucking truth. Bitch, you ain't just got me, motherfucker. Kids around me got you for me.
Let's break down the psychology of this audio, word by word. First, the distancing, when asked about Compton Street Legend. He immediately deflects. What's this book they say you wrote? He separates himself from the physical object. He speaks about it as if it belongs to someone else. He claims he didn't preach that kind of stuff, implying that the publishers, the co-authors, or the media twisted his casual conversations into a hardened confession to sell copies. He had my life up, he says, suggesting someone else controlled the narrative, packaged it, and sold it without his full understanding of the legal consequences. Then comes the justification. I clawed up under a rock for 6 years and I just got tired of it. This is a crucial psychological tell. For decades after Tupac's death, Keefe D was a ghost. He served time for unrelated charges, but he stayed completely out of the spotlight regarding the murder. He claims exhaustion drove him out of hiding. He wanted to clear his name. He wanted to tell his side of the story, not as a legal admission, but as a historical correction. But then comes the fatal admission, the phrase that his defense team is now using as the cornerstone of their entire legal strategy. I was paid to say that. This is the core of his current First Amendment defense. His lawyers are arguing to the judge that the book and the interviews were protected speech, entertainment, commerce, storytelling, hyperbole, not sworn affidavits. He is explicitly telling the person on the other end of the line that the confession was fabricated for financial gain. He was broke. He was tired of hiding. He saw a market for the truth, and he decided to sell a fictionalized version of it to the highest bidder. If you believe him now, you have to ask yourself a very difficult question. Is a man facing life in prison suddenly finding his moral compass? Is this the moment of genuine clarity, where a soul finally breaks under the weight of a decades-old lie? Or is this the desperate, calculated backtrack of a cornered animal, realizing the cage door is about to lock, and saying whatever it takes to slip through the bars? The prosecution believes it is the latter. They believe that a man does not invent specific, verifiable details about a white Cadillac, a meeting at a park, and a sequence of events on Flamingo Road just to sell paperbacks. They believe the 2019 Keefe D was telling the truth because he thought he was safe. And they believe the 2026 Keefe D is lying because he knows he is trapped. But if you think the retraction is the most explosive part of this call, you haven't heard the threat. Because buried beneath the excuses about book deals and paychecks, there is a much darker message being sent to the outside world. In any high-profile criminal case, the defendant holds one card that the prosecution desperately wants: names, accomplices, co-conspirators, the people who pulled the trigger, drove the car, provided the guns, or kept the secrets. The prosecution has Keefe D on a murder charge, but they want the entire conspiracy. They want to close the book on 1996 forever. Keefe D knows he holds this card. He knows the value of the names in his head, and in this call, he makes it abundantly clear that he knows exactly how to play it. Listen to the shift in his tone. The exhaustion is gone. The justification about the book deal is gone. The victimhood of being twisted by publishers is gone. This is pure, unfiltered street leverage. This is the voice of a man who realizes he has nothing left to lose, and decides to make sure everyone else has something to lose too. You ain't just got me. He is reminding whoever he is talking to, whether it's a family member, a former associate, or a legal runner, that he is not the only one exposed. He is implying that there are other people involved who are still walking free, breathing free air, while he sits in a concrete cell. He is spreading the liability. If he is going down, he is making sure the raft is crowded. And then, the chilling detail. Even my boy down the street from you. He places the conspiracy directly in the backyard of the person he is speaking to. This is not a vague threat. This is a geographic pinpoint. This perfectly aligns with recent claims made by Suge Knight, who has publicly stated from his own prison cell that Keefe D was not acting alone, and that there are others in Las Vegas and Los Angeles who know the full, unvarnished truth of what happened in the white Cadillac. Why say this on a recorded line? Why leave a digital footprint of a threat that the prosecution can easily use against him? There are two distinct possibilities, and both are fascinating from a legal perspective. The first possibility is witness intimidation. He is warning whoever he is talking to that snitching has consequences. He is reminding the outside world that he knows where they live, he knows who their associates are, and that the code of the street does not expire just because someone is wearing an orange jumpsuit. It is a reminder that the reach of the Kinahan-style organized crime syndicate, or in this case, the Southside Compton Crips, extends far beyond the prison walls. The second possibility is plea deal leverage. He is creating a paper trail, a recorded assertion that there are other, perhaps bigger, targets still on the street. He is doing this so that his lawyers can eventually walk into the district attorney's office, place a transcript on the desk, and say, "We can give you the bigger fish. We can give you the triggerman's handlers. We can give you the people down the street. But you have to give us a deal on the murder charge. You have to reduce this to manslaughter, or you have to give us a capped sentence." He is dangling the keys to the entire 1996 conspiracy in exchange for his freedom. He is weaponizing his own silence. But the prosecution isn't biting. They aren't rushing to cut a deal, because they don't need his cooperation anymore. They don't need him to point fingers at the people down the street. They already have his book. They already have the podcasts. They already have the interviews where he looked directly into a camera and said, "I was there." And that brings us to the most complex legal battle currently unfolding in the American justice system. This brings us to the courtroom in Las Vegas today. The legal battle unfolding right now is unlike anything we have seen in modern true crime. It is a clash between the reality of the streets and the theory of the Constitution. Keefe D's defense team is not just arguing innocence. They are...
You know what I'm saying? Let them know the motherfucking truth. Bitch, you ain't just got me, motherfuckers around me got you for me.
Mm-hmm.
That dirt rock, all them son of a bitches. You know?
Wow.
Yeah. Even my boy Jerome down the street from you. Louisa, all them motherfuckers.
Are not just arguing mistaken identity or lack of physical evidence. They are arguing that the United States government cannot use a commercially published memoir as the primary evidence for a murder conviction. They are invoking the First Amendment. They are asking the court to draw a hard line between a man confessing to a crime under oath and a man selling a story to the entertainment industry.
There was conversations about $1 million bounty on Suge.
Yeah.
But we're not going to say who it's from.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Rumors.
There was rumors of this whole thing.
Keefe D claims that there is this ongoing conversation. It happens on 3 different occasions But most specifically when he and Puffy are at this place called Greenblatt's Deli on Sunset. And they're there, things have spiraled out of control. Puffy's really concerned about, you know, the welfare is his safety. And he tells Keefe D, man, I just need you to take care of this situation with Suge and Tupac. It's out of control. You know, Tupac's on vinyl talking about killing all of our kids when they grow up. And, you know, it's just become this really serious conflict. And he says, I just need you to take care of him. And Keefe D's like, that's no problem. You know, that's what we do. And so an agreement was made, according to Keefe D, for an amount of money. And they kind of just let it go at that point in time. But of course, Keefe D knows in the back of his mind, this is what Puffy wants done. And they all end up out in Las Vegas.
You said in the book, at this point in my life, I can say that I have a deep sense of remorse for what happened to Tupac. He was a talented artist with tons of potential to impact the world. I hate that Tupac's family, friends, and fans, especially his mother, Afeni Shakur, had to go through the pain of losing her son. It's terrible losing people like that. I know that pain too well. However, I stand firm on the point that Tupac, Suge Knight, and the rest of those dudes didn't have any business putting their hands on my beloved nephew, Baby Lane, period. Then jumping on my nephew gave us the ultimate green light to do something to their ass.
The contrast is staggering. It is almost impossible to reconcile the two versions of the same man. On one side, you have the confident, wealthy author of 2019, sitting in a studio with a professional microphone, proudly claiming he orchestrated the retaliation. He is relaxed. He is smiling. He is in control of the narrative. On the other side, you have the incarcerated defendant of 2026, screaming into a plastic prison receiver that it was all a lie sold for cash. He is desperate. He is cornered. He is fighting for his life. The prosecution argues that actions speak louder than amendments. They point out that Keefe D didn't just write a fictional novel like Gone Girl or American Psycho. He included specific, verifiable details about the white Cadillac, the meeting at the park, and the sequence of events on Flamingo Road. Details that only someone inside the vehicle would know. Details that were never released to the public by the lapped or the leapt. They argue that you cannot sell the truth for profit for 5 years, build a brand on it, collect the checks, and then claim it's fiction when the bill finally comes due. They argue that the First Amendment protects your right to express an opinion, but it does not protect your right to confess to a murder and then call it a joke when the police arrive. But the defense is leaning heavily into the unreliability of the source. They are asking the jury to look closely at the man on the prison call. They are asking them to see a man who admits, on tape, that he will say whatever it takes to get a paycheck. A man who changes his story, depending on whether he is sitting in front of a microphone or sitting in front of a judge. They are arguing that if a man admits he fabricated a confession for money in 2019, how can a jury in 2026 possibly trust any of it? How can you prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the 2019 version is the absolute truth, and the 2026 version is the lie? What if both are lies? What if the truth is somewhere in the murky middle, obscured by 28 years of decay, ego, and greed? Furthermore, the defense is pointing to the total lack of physical evidence. There is no murder weapon. The .40 caliber Glock has never been found. There is no DNA linking Keefe D to the white Cadillac. There is no forensic evidence placing him at the intersection of Flamingo and Koval. The entire case rests on his own words. And if his own words are now officially retracted, labeled as paid fiction, and protected by the First Amendment, the prosecution's case collapses into a pile of hearsay. It is a legal tightrope of the highest order. If the judge rules that the book is admissible, Keefe D is likely looking at life in prison. If the judge rules that the book is protected commercial speech, the prosecution may be forced to drop the charges entirely, and the murder of Tupac Shakur will return to the cold case files for another 30 years. The entire world is watching to see if he falls. While the lawyers argue about the First Amendment in a climate-controlled courtroom in Las Vegas, there is another reality playing out on the streets of Dublin, Ireland, and the neighborhoods of Los Angeles. The Keefe D trial is not happening in a vacuum. It is the culmination of a blood feud that has spanned decades, cost dozens of lives, and destroyed countless families. The Kinahan Organized Crime Group, which shares eerie parallels with the Koch in terms of structure and impunity, operates on the same principle. The men at the top sit in luxury villas in Dubai or recording studios in LA, while the foot soldiers bleed in the streets. In Ireland, the fallout of the Regency Hotel shooting, the event that mirrors the Las Vegas shooting in its brazen public violence, has resulted in a relentless cycle of targeted violence. Young men, barely out of their teens, are recruited as muscle, promised money and respect, and then systematically eliminated when the tide turns. And innocent people are caught in the crossfire. Mothers, fathers, bystanders, people who had nothing to do with the drug trade, but who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The same is true for the East Coast-West Coast rivalry of the 1990s. While the executives at Death Row and Bad Boy Records were signing million-dollar contracts and appearing on the covers of magazines, the streets of Compton and Brooklyn were burning. Orlando Anderson, the alleged triggerman in the white Cadillac, was dead within 2 years, gunned down in an unrelated gang shootout. He was a foot soldier who paid the ultimate price for a war he didn't orchestrate. Keefe D survived. He survived the shootout. He survived the investigations. He survived the decades of silence. He even survived the publication of his own book. But his survival came at the cost of the truth. By monetizing the tragedy, by turning the death of Tupac Shakur into a commodity, he prolonged the grief of a family that just wanted to know what happened to their son. Shakur's mother, Keffe Shakur, spent the last years of her life searching for answers. She passed away in 2016. 3 years before Keefe D decided to cash in on the story. She never got to hear the confession. She never got to look the man in the eye and ask him why. She died with the silence intact. And now, the man who broke that silence is using it as a shield. He is hiding behind the very Constitution that Tupac Shakur rapped about, questioned, and ultimately died under. It is a bitter irony that the First Amendment is now being used to potentially free the man who confessed to silencing one of its greatest voices. Duane Davis wanted to be a legend. He wanted his name in the history books. He wanted the notoriety, the interviews, the podcast downloads, and the royalties that came with being the man who knew how Tupac died. He wanted to be the gatekeeper of the ultimate mystery. He got his wish. His name is in the history books. It is etched into the annals of hip-hop, right alongside the victim he claims to have helped destroy. But he is not sitting in a recording studio collecting checks. He is not sitting in a VIP section at a boxing match in Las Vegas. He is sitting in a concrete cell in Nevada, staring down the very real possibility of spending the rest of his natural life behind bars, listening to the automated voice at the start of every phone call, reminding him that he is owned by the state. And the weapon being used to keep him there is the very book he wrote to set himself free. He thought the grave protected him. He thought the statute of limitations was a shield that no prosecutor could pierce. He thought the truth was a commodity he could sell to the highest bidder, parcel out in 15-minute podcast segments without ever having to pay the cost. He thought the game was over, and he was the only one left holding the dice. But the law has a long memory. The transcripts have a longer memory, and the family of Tupac Shakur has the longest memory of all. Whether Keefe D is the mastermind who finally got caught in his own web, or an opportunistic liar who talked himself into a prison cell for a quick payday, one thing is undeniable. The silence that protected the killer for 28 years has been broken. The white Cadillac has been pulled over. The confessions have been read into the record, and the man who broke the silence is the one paying the price. Subscribe to the Black Docket. Turn on notifications. Leave a comment below. After hearing the prison call, do you believe Keefe D told the truth in 2019 for money, or is he lying now to avoid life in prison? Because history is on trial, and the least we can do is keep paying attention.